This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Father Thomas Weller had always been a man of deep conviction, a shepherd guiding his flock through the trials of faith. To the people of Jacksonville, Florida, he was more than a priest. He was a beacon of hope, a source of comfort in troubled times. St. Augustine's Church had flourished under his leadership, its pews filled every Sunday with devoted parishioners eager to hear his sermons. He filled the sermon cell at once. When the hour observed, Saturday 11 a.m., he spoke with authority, his voice carrying a strange hypnotic power that left his congregation spellbound. His presence commanded respect, and those who listened to him felt the weight of divine wisdom in every word he uttered. From the outside, he seemed like the perfect servant of God, humble yet powerful, compassionate yet firm. He was the kind of man who could hold a grieving widow's hands as she wept, who could baptize newborns with a fatherly smile, who could stand at the pulpit and inspire even the most wayward of souls to seek redemption. He organized charity drives, visited the sick, and comforted the dying. To his followers, he was nothing short of saintly. But beneath the mask of righteousness, something sinister lurked. In the dimly lit corners of his mind, a storm raged, a growing, insatiable hunger for control, for purity, for divine justice. The weight of sin disgusted him. Every Sunday, he looked into the eyes of his congregation and saw hypocrisy, filth, corruption, hiding behind forced smiles and hollow prayers. They came to church to be forgiven, but they left unchanged, returning to their sins the moment they stepped outside. Adulterers, thieves, liars, fornicators, they came before God with their hands outstretched, begging for mercy, but none of them truly repented. The more he preached about sin, the more he saw it everywhere. It seeped into the walls of the church, into the pews, into the air he breathed. The confessional booth became a place of torment. Week after week, he listened to the same sins, repeated over and over. A husband cheating on his wife, a young girl confessing to impure thoughts, a businessman embezzling money, a teenage boy drowning in lust, a paranoid domestic dispute that ultimately led to a school fire. They confessed, he absolved, and they sinned again. It was a cycle with no end, a mockery of God's mercy. He prayed for guidance, for strength, for clarity, but the more he prayed, the more he felt something stir inside him, a voice, a whisper, a divine commandment taking root in his soul. The world was beyond salvation. Forgiveness was a lie. These people did not need absolution. They needed judgment. He had spent years preaching about hell, warning of the eternal fire. But what if hell was not beneath them? What if it was already here, festering, growing, consuming everything in its path? And what if he had been chosen to cleanse it? At night, as he lay alone in his chambers, the thoughts consumed him. He saw visions of fire and blood, of screaming souls begging for mercy as divine wrath swallowed them whole. He saw himself standing above them, righteous and pure, an instrument of God's justice. He awoke drenched in sweat, but instead of fear, he felt a strange, electrifying sense of purpose. He had been blind for too long, shackled by the church's cowardice, by the endless cycle of false forgiveness. Now at last he saw the truth. The change was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. His sermons grew darker, filled with warnings of damnation. He spoke of God's wrath, of the coming reckoning, of the need for true repentance. Some of his parishioners were unsettled, whispering among themselves that something about Father Weller had changed. But others clung to his words, their fear turning to devotion. They trusted him, believed in him, followed him without question. He began fasting for days, retreating into solitude, scouring the scriptures for answers. He fixated on passages of divine punishment, Sodom and Gomorrah reduced to ash, the great flood wiping out the unworthy, the plagues of Egypt striking down sinners. The Bible was filled with blood, with death, with the purging of the impure. Was this not proof of God's will? Was this not a sign that the world could only be cleansed through fire? The more he read, the more he became convinced that he was being called to act. But doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. Was this truly God's plan, or was it madness taking hold? Then, one evening, he received what he believed to be a divine confirmation. As he stood before the altar, staring at the large crucifix hanging above him, the candles flickered violently, despite the absence of wind. The air in the church grew heavy, suffocating, pressing down on him like an unseen force. His knees buckled, and he collapsed before the cross, his breath ragged, his vision blurring. And then he heard it. Not a whisper this time, but a voice, clear and commanding, resonating through his very bones. Depleted, tears streamed down his face as he trembled before the altar. He had been chosen. He had been called. God had spoken to him, given him a task, entrusted him with the burden of purification. It was no longer a question of morality. This was his purpose. This was his. From that moment on, there was no turning back. He abandoned the old ways, no longer seeking to save souls through words and prayers. He was no longer merely a shepherd guiding his flock. He was the sword of God, the executioner of divine will. And when the time came, when the final sermon was spoken, he would not hesitate. He would cleanse the impure. He would bring judgment upon the wicked, and he would do it all in the name of the Lord. At first, the changes were subtle, almost imperceptible, like a sickness creeping through Father Thomas Weller's mind, distorting his perception of the world. To the congregation, he remained their beloved priest, but behind closed doors, in the quiet solitude of his chambers, something inside him was unraveling. His thoughts became tangled in a web of paranoia and obsession. His prayers filled not with humility, but with a twisted longing for divine destruction. The whispers that had once been fleeting now echoed constantly in his head, urging him to act, to cleanse, to purify. His sermons grew harsher, no longer gentle calls for redemption, but fire and brimstone condemnations. His voice trembled with an eerie fervor as he preached about the wages of sin, his eyes gleaming with something dark and unhinged. He fixated on the idea of judgment, warning his congregation that the world was rotting, that the time of reckoning was near. Yashas's sermons morphed into one of pessimism, but it led. Gone were the days of comforting words and hopeful promises. Now, he spoke of hell as though he had seen it with his own eyes, as though he had walked its burning halls and returned with a message from the abyss. The church staff began to notice. Sister Evelyn, the elderly nun who had served at St. Augustine's for decades, found him standing alone in the sanctuary late one night, whispering prayers to the crucifix, his fingers trembling as they traced the shape of Christ's suffering body. He did not acknowledge her when she called his name, did not turn when she placed a hand on his shoulder. He simply stood there, muttering to himself in frantic, desperate tones, his breath shallow and quick. The sacristan, a devout young man named Daniel, discovered that Father Weller had stopped eating. The meals left at his door remained untouched for days, the bread growing stale, the water gathering dust. His face became gaunt, his skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, his eyes sunken and hollow, and yet, despite his emaciated appearance, he carried himself with a feverish energy, moving through the church like a man possessed. The confessional became his personal torment. He sat for hours in the suffocating darkness, listening to the sins of his flock, his hands gripping the edges of his seat so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The words burned into his mind, each confession another nail in the coffin of his dwindling sanity. They came to him with their petty transgressions, lies, lust, betrayal, and expected absolution. They wanted forgiveness, but none of them wanted to change. They disgusted him. The smell of sweat and breath in the confessional made his stomach turn, and more than once, he found himself clenching his teeth to keep from screaming. Then, the dreams began. They were unlike any visions he had experienced before. In them, he stood in the center of the church, the stained glass windows shattered, the pews overturned, the floor slick with blood. His congregation knelt before him, their heads bowed, their hands clasped in silent, trembling prayer. But their prayers were useless. They had been judged. They had been found wanting. And it was his duty to see them purified. He woke from these dreams drenched in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. He should have been afraid. He should have questioned what was happening to him. but instead, he felt exhilarated, as though he had glimpsed a truth too profound for ordinary men to comprehend. The whispers in his head grew louder. One night, the janitor found him in the church basement, kneeling before a collection of old, discarded religious artifacts. Candles flickered around him, casting jagged shadows on the damp stone walls. His lips moved in silent prayer, his hands clutching a rusted crucifix so tightly that blood seeped from his palms. When the janitor called his name, he did not react. He simply continued his prayer, his face contorted in something between ecstasy and agony. Strange things began happening around the church. The holy water in the font turned cloudy, as though something unseen had tainted it. The air in the confessional grew heavy and stifling, filling with the scent of decay. The statues of saints seemed different. Daniel swore that their eyes followed him as he walked past. The candles in the sanctuary flickered violently, even when there was no breeze. Father Weller himself became increasingly erratic. He stopped sleeping, his eyes rimmed with dark shadows, his hands twitching as though he were trying to grasp something unseen. He spoke to himself in hushed, urgent tones, his fingers tracing invisible patterns in the air. His sermons became less structured, more frantic. He ranted about the end times, about the need for purification, about the fires of divine wrath that would soon descend upon the world. People began to whisper. Some stopped attending services, frightened by the madness creeping into their priest's voice. Others clung to his words, mistaking his mania for divine inspiration. A few tried to confront him. Sister Evelyn, Daniel, even the bishop. But he brushed them aside with a cold, knowing smile. They did not understand. They could not see what he saw. Then came the day he locked himself in the church for 3 days and 3 nights. No one knew what he was doing inside. They heard him chanting, heard the scrape of furniture being moved, heard strange, rhythmic thumps against the walls. When he finally emerged, his cassock was stained with something dark, his eyes wild and feverish. He called it a revelation. He called it preparation. No one dared ask what he meant. And then, one by one, the crosses in the church began turning upside down. The sun rose over Jacksonville with an eerie stillness, casting long, golden streaks through the stained glass windows of St. Augustine's Church. It was a Sunday like any other, and the congregation arrived in droves, their voices light with idle chatter, their faces bright with the warmth of routine. They greeted one another with nods and smiles, exchanged whispers about their week, took their usual seats in the pews. The choir prepared their hymnals, the ushers guided families to their places, and the scent of burning incense filled the cavernous room. No one noticed the way Father Weller stood at the altar, motionless, his eyes fixed on the crucifix above him. No one saw the way his lips moved in silent, fevered prayer. No one suspected that today they had not come for salvation, they had come to die. At precisely 10 a.m., the service began. The doors were locked from the inside. Father Weller's voice boomed through the church, deep and commanding, filled with a strange, chilling intensity. He spoke of sin, of corruption, of a world beyond redemption. His hands gripped the edges of the pulpit so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His breath labored as he delivered his sermon. But something was wrong. His words were not messages of hope, not gentle reminders of God's mercy. They were warnings. They were declarations. He spoke of the flood that had washed the earth clean, of Sodom and Gomorrah reduced to ash, of the plagues that had struck down the wicked. He spoke of the sacrifices required to cleanse a world so defiled. Then the first gunshot rang out. The sound split the air like a crack of thunder, echoing through the high-vaulted ceilings. A woman in the front pew slumped forward, her blood spilling across the open pages of her Bible. For a moment there was silence, a collective inhale of disbelief, a frozen second where reality had not yet settled into the minds of those gathered. Then came the screaming. Panic erupted in waves. The congregation scrambled for the doors, but they would not budge. They pounded their fists against the heavy wooden frames, their voices rising in terrified pleas, their sobs filling the sacred space. But there was no escape. Father Weller stood firm at the altar, his black cassock swaying as he reached beneath it and pulled out another weapon. This time, a sawed-off shotgun. He moved with calculated precision, his face eerily serene as he fired round after round into the crowd. Bodies crumpled in the aisles, blood splattering across the white marble floor, staining the church walls like grotesque murals of suffering. A child shrieked as his mother collapsed beside him, her eyes still wide with shock, her fingers twitching in a futile attempt to reach for him. An elderly man clutched his chest as buckshot tore through his ribs, his rosary slipping from his trembling fingers. Father Weller did not flinch. He did not hesitate. He did not stop. The choir tried to flee through the side exit, but the door had been bolted shut. One of the sopranos, a young woman with auburn curls, pressed herself against the stained glass window, her hands leaving bloody smears on the colorful panes as she pounded for help. The shotgun blast took her in the back, sending shards of glass cascading onto the church floor like jagged raindrops. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic stench of blood. The cries of the dying mixed with the desperate prayers of those who still clung to hope, whispering to a God who had already abandoned them. Father Weller walked among them like a specter, his steps slow and deliberate, his breath coming in measured sighs. He moved through the wreckage of his own making, stepping over the lifeless bodies of those who had once called him their shepherd. There was no remorse in his eyes, no flicker of doubt. He was not a man anymore. He was something else entirely, something cold and unfeeling, something beyond human comprehension. He was the vessel of judgment, the hand of retribution, the sword of divine wrath. A teenage boy, no older than 16, crawled toward the altar, his leg shattered from a bullet wound. He reached for the crucifix, his fingers brushing against the base of it as if salvation could still be found in this unholy massacre. Father Weller watched him for a moment, then calmly pressed the barrel of his pistol against the boy's forehead and pulled the trigger. The body slumped against the altar, blood pooling at the base of the cross. The church bells rang outside, their chimes oblivious to the carnage unfolding within. The massacre continued without pause, without hesitation. Those who tried to hide were found. Those who begged for mercy were silenced. One by one they fell, their bodies forming a grotesque mosaic of flesh and fabric, their lifeless eyes staring into the void. Father Weller moved with the grace of a man who believed he was fulfilling his divine purpose, his hands steady, his expression tranquil. Then, something shifted. A rustling noise from the back of the church, a flicker of movement in the chaos. A girl, no older than 19, had managed to pry open a side window. Emily Rhodes, a choir singer, had seen the opportunity and taken it, despite the bullet wound in her shoulder, despite the pain that burned through her body with every movement. She hoisted herself through the narrow opening, glass slicing into her hands, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Father Weller turned. Their eyes met for a single, harrowing second, then she was gone. A sliver of rage cut through him, brief but sharp. One had escaped. One had slipped through his grasp, had defied the judgment that had been cast, but it did not matter. The work was nearly complete. The church was silent now, save for the faint, shuddering breaths of the dying. The scent of gunpowder and blood hung thick in the air. The walls, once pristine and white, were streaked with crimson, the pews broken, the altar defiled with the bodies of the fallen. Father Weller stood amidst it all, his weapons empty, his cassock soaked in the blood of his congregation. He raised his arms, his head tilting back, his lips curling into something that might have been a smile. It was done. The cleansing had begun. Emily Rhodes had never known the true meaning of terror until that Sunday morning, when Father Weller turned St. Augustine's Church into a slaughterhouse. One moment she was standing in the choir loft, her hymnal open, her voice raised in praise, and the next, chaos erupted. The first gunshot shattered the illusion of safety, the deafening crack of the bullet tearing through flesh, followed by the sickening, wet thud of a body hitting the floor. Then came the screams, a chorus of panic, raw and desperate, echoing through the vaulted ceilings. She didn't understand what was happening at first. Her brain refused to process it, to accept that the man who had baptized her as a child, who had prayed over her sick mother, who had once blessed her family's home, was now methodically executing his own congregation. But denial crumbled the moment she saw Mrs. Holloway, the elderly woman who had sat in the front pew every Sunday for as long as Emily could remember, her frail body crumpling forward, blood pouring from the hole in her chest. The hymnal in her lap was soaked in red. The church had become a nightmare. Emily had to move. Instinct took over, drowning out reason, replacing it with a singular, animalistic urge. Run! She ducked beneath the choir loft railing just as another shot rang out, the echo bouncing off the stone walls. Below her, bodies littered the aisles, twisted in unnatural angles, blood pooling around them in dark, spreading puddles. Some of them still twitched, their fingers grasping for something. Help, salvation, life. But there was none to be found. Father Weller was a shadowy figure at the altar, his cassock billowing as he moved, his weapon raised, his aim precise. The exit doors were blocked. She could see them from her vantage point. Dozens of hands pounding against the heavy wood, fingernails scraping at the metal locks, shoulders slamming against the unyielding frame. But there was no way out. The cries for help were swallowed by more gunfire. The air smelled like incense and gunpowder, thick with the metallic sting of blood. She crawled across the loft, careful to keep her body low, her breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. Every movement felt agonizingly slow, every second stretched into eternity. Her shoulder burned, a hot, searing pain that she hadn't even registered until now. She reached up with a trembling hand and felt the warm, sticky wetness of blood seeping through her dress. She had been shot. When? How? It didn't matter. She had to keep going. Below her, the massacre continued. A young boy, no older than 10, sobbed beside the lifeless body of his father, his tiny hands shaking as he tried to shake him awake. Father Weller approached, his steps measured, unhurried, the barrel of the gun leveled with the child's forehead. Emily squeezed her eyes shut. She couldn't look. She couldn't watch. A single shot. Silence. A wave of nausea rolled through her, but she forced it down. She had to escape. Then she saw it. A window, high on the wall near the back of the church, partially obscured by a thick velvet curtain. It was small, but if she could reach it, she might have a chance. Might. It was all she had. The wooden beams of the choir loft groaned beneath her weight as she pulled herself toward the edge, her fingers grasping at the stone ledge below the window. Her body screamed in protest, her wounded shoulder flaring with white-hot agony, but she clenched her teeth and hauled herself up. The glass was cold beneath her fingers. She could feel the outside world just beyond it, so close yet impossibly far. Then she heard him, footsteps, slow, deliberate, climbing the stairs to the loft. He had seen her, her breath hitched, every muscle in her body tensed. She could feel his presence without even turning around, could sense the weight of his gaze, the unwavering calm in his movements. The predator, closing in. She had no time. With a desperate, ragged gasp, she shoved against the window pane. It didn't budge. She pushed harder, her bloody fingers slipping against the glass. The footsteps grew closer. The heavy fabric of his cassock rustled. He was near. Emily clenched her fists and drove her elbow into the glass. Once. Twice. On the third strike, the pane shattered, shards raining down in jagged fragments. Cold air rushed in, stinging her face, filling her lungs with the crisp scent of freedom. Then, a hand clamped around her ankle. A jolt of pure terror shot through her as she kicked wildly, her foot colliding with something solid. The grip loosened for a fraction of a second, just enough. She lunged forward, her body twisting as she forced herself through the broken window, glass slicing into her skin. The world outside was blinding, the morning sun glaring against the pavement below. She fell. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, sent a fresh wave of agony through her already battered body. For a moment, she lay still, her vision swimming, black spots creeping into the edges of her sight. Then, above her, she saw him. Father Weller stood at the broken window, staring down at her, his face eerily tranquil, his expression one of almost serene disappointment. Blood splattered his cassock, his hands, his face. A priest bathed in the sacrifice of his own making. For a moment, they locked eyes. Then he turned away. She was no longer his concern. He still had work to do. Emily forced herself to her feet, her legs shaking beneath her. She stumbled forward, nearly collapsing under the weight of exhaustion and pain, but she moved. Every step felt impossible, but she kept going. She had to. The church bells rang behind her, their sound hollow, distant, meaningless. With her last ounce of strength, she reached the street, her voice raw, her throat torn from screaming. The world blurred around her, but she saw figures in the distance. People, movement, safety. And then, finally, darkness took her. The blood-soaked silence inside St. Augustine's church did not last long. Outside, the first sirens wailed through the streets of Jacksonville, a chorus of dread rolling toward the scene of slaughter. Red and blue lights slashed through the morning haze, casting unnatural shadows against the stained glass windows. The emergency calls had been frantic, disjointed. The operators had heard it all before. But this was different. Massacre. Dozens dead. The priest is the shooter. The Jacksonville SWAT team arrived first, black-clad figures pouring onto the church steps, rifles raised, their boots thudding against the pavement. Police cruisers screeched to a halt, officers leaping out with weapons drawn. The street was chaos. Bystanders, some in their Sunday best, clutched each other, sobbing, their hands stained with the blood of those they had tried to pull from the wreckage. The paramedics swarmed the survivors, shouting over each other as they assessed wounds, as they counted the dead. One officer turned and vomited onto the pavement. Another just stood, frozen, staring at the church doors, his face drained of color. Inside, Father Thomas Weller stood among the bodies, his cassock heavy with blood, his breathing slow and deliberate. The stench of death hung thick in the air. The once sacred space was now a charnel house, the pews overturned, the walls streaked with arterial spray. His congregation lay where they had fallen, their hands still curled as if in prayer, their lifeless eyes staring at the vaulted ceiling, as if searching for the God who had abandoned them. Father Weller felt no remorse, no sorrow, no regret. He had done what needed to be done. He closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and listened. The cries outside, the approaching footsteps, the heavy shuffle of tactical gear. They had come. The time had arrived. The church doors trembled beneath the weight of a battering ram. A moment later, they burst inward, splinters flying, daylight spilling into the darkness. The SWAT team surged forward, weapons sweeping the space, voices barking orders. The first thing they saw was the carnage. Bodies stacked in unnatural heaps, the pews littered with corpses, the altar a grotesque shrine to slaughter. The second thing they saw was him. Father Weller stood at the pulpit, his hands raised, palms facing outward. For a fraction of a second, there was hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty, as if the presence of a man in priestly robes, no matter how blood-soaked, did not align with the image of a monster. But then, a twitch of movement, a flash of steel. He moved. The first shot rang out, deafening in the cavernous space. The SWAT officer closest to him jerked backward, his Kevlar vest absorbing most of the impact, but the force sent him sprawling onto the blood-slick floor. The rest of the team reacted instantly, unleashing a hail of gunfire, their rounds slamming into the pews, splintering wood, shattering what little remained of the sanctuary's peace. But Father Weller was fast. Too fast. He dove behind the altar, his breath steady, his mind sharp. Bullets whizzed overhead, embedding themselves in the stone pillars. He reached beneath his cassock, his fingers curling around the grip of his final weapon, a sawed-off shotgun. Its barrel shortened, its purpose singular. Judgment was not yet complete. With calculated precision, he rose and fired. The blast ripped through the air, catching one of the officers mid-step. He crumpled instantly, his chest torn open, his rifle clattering onto the floor beside him. Another officer screamed for cover. The SWAT team scattered, repositioning, voices crackling over their radios. Outside, more sirens, more movement. They had come in force. Father Weller knew he would not leave this place alive. That did not matter. The work had been done. His hands, now stained with the blood of the impure, had carried out the will of the divine. These men, these intruders, they were merely the final obstacles. He would send as many of them to hell as he could before they silenced him. A flashbang arced through the air, landing just feet from him. Detonation. White-hot light engulfed his vision. His ears filled with an ear-splitting roar. The world spun. His knees buckled. But still he did not fall. He could not fall. Stumbling forward, half-blind, he fired again. His shot wild, tearing through the pulpit, shattering what remained of the wooden cross that loomed over the sanctuary. Then, a force like thunder struck his shoulder. A bullet tore through his flesh, spinning him sideways, sending his shotgun skidding across the blood-soaked floor. He gasped, his breath hitching, but he did not cry out. Pain was irrelevant. Hands grabbed him, heavy, gloved, unyielding. A boot pressed between his shoulder blades, shoving him down onto the cold marble floor, his cheek smearing through the gore of his own making. The voices above him shouted, but he did not listen. Their words were meaningless. These men were blind, unable to see the truth, unable to comprehend the righteousness of his actions. They wrenched his arms behind his back, twisting them at unnatural angles, forcing him onto his knees. He felt the barrel of a rifle press against the back of his skull. A final warning. A final demand. But Father Weller did not beg. Instead, he laughed, low at first, then rising, bubbling, a grotesque gurgling sound, a sound that sent a shiver down the spine of the officer holding him. It was not the laughter of a man who had lost. It was the laughter of a man who believed, truly believed, that he had won. Then, in the final moment before his world turned to darkness, he whispered his last words, words that would haunt the survivors, words that would echo through the ruins of St. Augustine's church, long after the blood had been scrubbed away. I am God's hand. The gunshot rang out, final and absolute. Father Thomas Weller's body crumpled to the floor, his head snapping forward, blood pooling beneath him. The officers did not move for several seconds, as if expecting him to rise, as if the force of his conviction alone could defy death. But he was gone. Outside, the sirens wailed, the news helicopters circled, the reporters gathered like vultures, their cameras ready, their voices rehearsing the words that would dominate every broadcast for weeks to come. Inside, the church remained silent. The SWAT officers moved through the carnage, counting the dead, securing the scene, their boots leaving fresh prints in the congealing blood. It was over. But for those who had witnessed it, for those who had survived it, the nightmare had only just begun. Jacksonville had never known horror like this before. The massacre at St. Augustine's Church became an open wound in the city's history, raw and festering, impossible to ignore. The bodies were removed, tagged, cataloged. 55 souls, each one reduced to a name on a list, a statistic in a growing archive of American tragedy. The blood was scrubbed from the floors, but the stain remained, not just on the stone, but in the minds of those who had witnessed the slaughter. The media descended like vultures, their cameras capturing every angle of the ruined sanctuary, their voices heavy with manufactured solemnity. News anchors recounted the horror with practiced cadence, their scripts neatly arranged with words like unspeakable and devastating. Analysts speculated about Father Thomas Weller, dissecting his sermons, his past, his motives. The nation demanded answers, but there were none that could ever make sense of the carnage. Outside the police barricades, mourners gathered, their trembling hands clutching candles, photographs, crucifixes. Parents sobbed for their children, widows collapsed in grief, entire families were wiped away in a single Sunday morning. Survivors of the massacre, those few who had crawled out from beneath the bodies, who had hidden behind overturned pews, who had lived when so many had not, were left haunted, their eyes hollow, their sleep stolen by nightmares that replayed in endless loops. Emily Rhodes, the sole escapee who had managed to reach the outside world before the massacre ended, remained in critical condition at St. Vincent's Hospital. Her body was battered, stitched together with the precision of surgeons who could heal flesh, but not the mind. She did not speak, she barely moved. Her eyes were open, staring past the walls, locked in some distant place, trapped in the moment when she had locked eyes with the man she had once called her priest. The doctors whispered about psychological trauma, but there were no words to describe the abyss inside her. The police worked tirelessly, unraveling the life of Father Weller, peeling back the layers of a man they had once assumed to be righteous. His small apartment was ransacked for clues, the drawers emptied, the closets gutted, the walls stripped bare. And that was where they found them. The diaries. Dozens of leather-bound journals, meticulously kept, each one filled with thousands of pages of Father Weller's thoughts, his confessions, his descent into madness. The words were scrawled in obsessive detail, scripture twisted into proclamations of doom, theological ramblings that grew more erratic with each passing year. The early entries spoke of faith, of duty, of love for his congregation. But then came the shift, the obsession, the voices, the certainty that God had chosen him as an instrument of purification. There were diagrams drawn with shaking hands, maps of the church, seating arrangements for his final sermon, escape routes carefully marked but never intended for him. There were lists of sins, assigned to the names of his parishioners, each one labeled with their transgressions: adultery, greed, lust, pride, blasphemy. There was a passage written over and over again, covering entire pages, repeating in frantic, slanted handwriting, "The fire will cleanse them." But the journals held more than just his delusions. They held secrets. The investigators reading the pages felt the weight of something deeper, something worse than the massacre itself. These were not the writings of a man who had simply gone mad. They were the writings of a man who had been waiting, planning, preparing for years. There were confessions of acts that had never been reported, atrocities buried beneath the mask of holiness, missing persons, parishioners who had quietly vanished over the years, assumed to have moved away, assumed to have simply left the church. There were names, descriptions, dates. Father Weller had not simply killed once. The records were cross-checked. Names were matched. The numbers did not add up. 13 people had disappeared during his time at St. Augustine's. The police returned to the church, combing through every inch of the building. The basement was their focus, cold, damp, forgotten. They tore apart the old storage rooms, pried up the floorboards, followed the foul scent that had long been masked by incense and dust. And then, beneath the stone foundation, they found it, a chamber. The air was thick with rot. The walls were lined with crude carvings, scripture etched into the stone with nails with fingertips. Chains hung from the ceiling, rusted and stained. And in the dirt, piled like discarded relics, they found the bones. The victims had been buried in the church itself, hidden beneath the feet of those who had unknowingly prayed above them. The remains were contorted, shattered, their skulls bearing the fractures of blunt force trauma. Some had their hands bound, others had their mouths stuffed with cloth. They had not died quickly. The revelation turned the massacre into something worse, something unholy, something ancient in its cruelty. The news broke, and the world recoiled. Father Thomas Weller was no longer just a mass murderer. He was a serial killer, one who had spent years perfecting his ritual of judgment before unleashing his final act of divine wrath. The public demanded to know how no one had seen the signs, how a priest, a man of God, had carried out these horrors beneath the very church that had trusted him. The Vatican issued a statement, distancing itself from the tragedy, expressing deep sorrow. The Bishop of Jacksonville resigned. St. Augustine's Church was permanently shut down, its doors sealed, its grounds fenced off. The diocese declared it defiled, a place unfit for worship, its foundation forever soaked in sin. But still, the questions remain. Had Father Weller truly acted alone? Had no one else known? Had no one else helped? The police interrogated former staff, questioned the remaining clergy, scoured every document they could find. Yet some things remained unanswered. Some things refused to come into the light. Rumors swirled. Whispers spread. There were those who claimed to have seen others visiting Father Weller at odd hours, shadowed figures slipping into the rectory, never seen during the day. There were those who believed he had followers, disciples, who had shared in his twisted faith, who had known what he was doing but had remained silent, waiting, watching. And then there were the letters, unmarked envelopes, arriving at the homes of the victims' families. No return addresses, no postage. Inside, a single piece of paper, bearing only 3 words. The fire remains. Jacksonville tried to move on. The city tried to forget. But how could it? The walls of St. Augustine still stood, dark and silent. The stained glass windows now shattered. The once sacred halls, nothing more than a tomb. And somewhere, in the deepest corners of the city, in the hidden places where secrets fester, something waited. Because faith does not die, it evolves.